Well, there was at the time on the local New York ABC station, I can't remember whether I told you this before, a show that was quite bad. It had good elements, at least it had one good element. But structurally, whoever were the producers, they had made a mistake. They had, instead of the traditional one star or MC, they had about 40. The main host was a disc jockey, radio disc jockey, a charming fellow, a friend of mine, but he had no chops as an entertainer. You know, with a nice voice, that's one thing, but talent is another. So that's one of the reasons the show didn't work. And then there was a singer, Dick something or other, who sang nicely, but he also, it didn't make sense to have him suddenly show up and run the show for 12 minutes. And then there was some announcer who also got in the way of the other people. But fortunately, there was one fellow who showed up some of the nights, at least when I saw the show, and he was just delightful. He was one of those people who just is funny. You might say, aren't all comedians funny? The answer is no. Sometimes they're not at all, unless they're on stage, and sometimes not even always then. But he was above his material. You can tell that if people bomb because the material is bad, then there's a little something lacking in them. But with certain people, Sid Caesar, Jonathan Winter, whoever, anyway, I'm talking about Louis Nye. He was always funny. So by chance, I ran into him in the RCA building one day and told him, introduced myself. He didn't know me, and before that, I didn't know him. I said, I'm starting a new late night show, and I think you're marvelous on that thing that they just canceled on ABC or whatever had happened to it. If you want to work with me, I'll be glad to have you as a guest. He said, fine. So I called him, and that's how I picked up Louis. We're still dear friends. As I've said before, our show was a talk show, but not all nights. And I don't think it should have been all night. Even now, I would occasionally like to see, I don't know, wouldn't you like to see Jay Leno introduce a symphony orchestra next Thursday just for a switch? Doesn't mean his show is bad, but he could give you a little more variety. So we did. We had a lot of variety on that very first, what became The Tonight Show. And I would do the standard talk show things, introduce a guest and put questions to him. But we would do experimental things, take cameras out into the street and do an occasional sketch with Louis Nye. We didn't have our regular comedy company then. That came later with my primetime comedy show. But I wish I could give you more specific answers, because it would be important even for me to recollect everything we did. But you probably have heard the sad story of the fellow who burned all those early shows. They started burning them in the late 50s, and consequently the combination of all the destroyed shows plus my eroding memory means that not a great many answers of a factual nature are now forthcoming. When the show started, we didn't have any. Today that might sound like science fiction, because the average talk show has, 19, 20 writers. I mean, literally that much. I remember one year, a few years ago, when David Letterman's show was particularly hot, and it won that year's whatever comedy writing category or something of the sort. And they said, the winner is the David Letterman show. And about 19 people got up with their wives and agents to accept the award. It looked like half the audience was attacking the stage. But in contrast to that, we had no writers at all when the late show started. And then a few months after that, with a lot of ad-libbing going on, and my using some earlier routines I'd written before, plus some new things I'd written, I ran into a fellow in the drugstore across the street. His name was Stan Burns. I only knew him as a new man in the drugstore, and he said he liked the show, and he said, I noticed you don't have anybody writing for you. I said, yeah. He said, I'd like to write for you. I said, I don't object. I'd like everybody to do everything for me. So I said, why don't you come with me across the street? We'll see if there's any money for writing in the budget. So he said, fine. So we went across the street. I introduced him to our producer, Billy Harbach, and that led to a steady job. And
now, that was on The Tonight Show, though, was it?
That was on the local version
the
of the
good.
Tonight Show, before we got to the network version.
Yep.
And then after a few weeks, where Stan and I did whatever little writing there was, he said, I have a good friend who's a very strong writer, and if there's enough in the budget to hire another man. Anyway, one word led to another, and we added at that point Herb Sargent, who became better known in recent years, I suppose, because he's the president or whatever the office is of the Writers Guild, Eastern Branch, New York branch. And also he was on the staff as gray eminence for about 15 years of Saturday Night Live. I used to occasionally say to him when I would see a sketch in dreadfully poor taste that I knew he would never have written or even endorsed, And I would say, Herb, you're the boss there, the writing staff. You must know that that was a dumb sketch. He said, I did. I told him, and they wouldn't listen to me.